So one thing I've always loved doing is giving advice. As someone who wants to give advice, it makes sense that I'd want to get advice from other people as well. I'll ask anybody. I ask drug dealers, drug addicts, gamblers, men, women, old people, young people, attractive people, ugly people. I'll ask anybody for advice. Now obviously the advice is very hit or miss, but one thing I've picked up on is the language that people use when they're trying to give advice. And I'm able to tell whether it's good advice or bad advice based on how they sound and what words they use. And when I tell you, the funniest people to get advice from are addicts, whether that's drug addicts or, I don't know, lottery or anything really. It can be any type of addiction, but addicts are the best. What makes the advice from addicts and drug addicts hilarious is that the advice they'll give 9 times out of 10 will be good advice, but only if you apply it to something that they're not talking about. Like for example, like people who play the lottery, right? Most of the time when I ask them why they do it, they usually give something along the lines of, you have to be in it to win it, right? Take that for anything else. School or any type of education, jobs, interviews, networking. It can be anything else that has nothing to do with gambling, and that advice is A1. But when you hear them try and justify their reasons for doing what they do, most of the time the advice they give is something like that, something that's good for anything else apart from gambling. Now, the ironic part of this is that I'm about to give you advice, but I've spent ages coming up with this information. I've worked at Sainsbury's in different areas for years, and if there's one thing we get, it's a bunch of different people going through a bunch of different walks of life, coming through and buying stuff. It's a supermarket. So I've had the chance to talk with so many people, and these are things that I've just noticed and built up over time. So this is really my experience I'm talking to you with. Now, when it comes to addicts, they tend to be more open about their life experiences compared to just a regular person or someone not going through it. So when you ask them about things like this, or most of the time they just tend to tell you for some reason, but they're going to recount their own life memories, their own decisions, and it's going to invoke some type of emotional reaction. A lot of the times you can tell what they're saying, whether they believe it or not, based on those reactions. Things like tone of voice, facial features, if they move around a lot, like if they're fidgety or if they're uncomfortable, if their mood changes, things like that, right? And sometimes that's what you got to look out for instead of the actual advice itself, because a lot of the times, as I said earlier, they can give advice that applies to other forms of life or other walks of life, not to what they're actually trying to talk about. You never know what you're walking into. If you pay attention to those things and you notice a shift in the conversation, it shifted for a reason. It's not a coincidence. Chances are they're not very happy with where they are in life. They wish they could have done things different. Most of the time, they just wish they could change, but they've accepted themselves for what they are. I see so many people who buy cigarettes, buy lottery, they vape and all these type of things. And when I talk to them, I realize that they themselves wish that they weren't doing it. They wish they could stop. They wish they could save money. They wish they could do all these things, but they've already accepted that this is the life they live. They don't do anything about it. They don't try. And that's what happens with most addicts at this point that aren't fucking fully crazy yet. A lot of them wish that they were different. They were, quote, more normal, whatever that means. And they've just accepted their life as to this is what it is right now. Now, one piece of advice I will give is to listen to everyone's advice, even if they're hypocrites. Now, obviously, we have to give a bit of a discount to the amount of advice we take seriously from hypocrites, but I would still say listen to their advice, like seriously, because hypocrites tend to actually give good advice sometimes. It's just that we discount it because they're hypocritical. But it's important to listen to these people because not only will we gain their perspective on life, you'll be able to become familiar with some of the language they use, and you'll be able to sniff out someone else who's a hypocrite, potentially anyway. I also think that in general, you'll tend to become more accepting to information you don't want to hear, especially if you get advice from people who you think aren't worthy for whatever reason. This world's about constantly learning. You're always going to learn new things. You're never going to learn everything in this world. And there are going to be people who you don't think have information come forward with information. So I think it's important to accept knowledge from whoever's willing to give you some. And the last thing I want to say is never make a decision based on one person's advice. One person's advice on their own is pretty much useless. You have to research. You have to, at least at the bare minimum, ask different people. Now, you could ask one person and they could give you a wild experience or a wild answer that 7 other people haven't gone through. So it's important to get research, and it's important to ask a lot of people before jumping to decisions, because even though their advice is still valid, you want to make sure it aligns with what's most likely going to happen to you. That's all I got. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you guys agree with what I'm saying. If you don't, leave it in the comments. That's it, really. Take care.
I'm not a savior nor a saint. Told 30s and sticks with an open case. I try to behave when I know I can't. So purpose of this is to motivate. What's the ticket? Shit we can negotiate. Take a toke of the law while I pour the drink.